So just a couple secrets about this room, which is they just had a conversation around global warming, heating, and new power. So they amped up the heat in the room a lot. So you could really empathize with what the issues are. So just one thing. And then the other thing is that Tom and I like to think of ourselves as free-range presenters, but what you might not know about Aspen presenters is that we all have leashes on us, so we actually can't get far. So just so you know, we're stuck. So if you need to talk to us, we're right here. I'm going to take a moment to introduce Tom Kelley. Tom Kelley is a partner at IDEO, has been kind of intricately involved in pretty much all the leadership aspects of IDEO, at least since I've been there and well before. Works with his brother David Kelley quite closely and has done just some amazing things for us as an organization. I think one of the things that Tom does that we value, or at least that I value most around the work that he does at IDEO, is that he's a chronicler of the things that IDEO puts out in the world and the kind of methods and things that we think about. And so if you do know Tom's work, he's actually written several books around innovation and how innovation applies to many, many things. So Art of Innovation, I believe, is the first one, 10 Faces of Innovation. And the point of a lot of his work has been, how does innovation design methodologies apply to the business world primarily? I mean, that's actually, I think that's kind of a lot of where he's been. Recently, about a year ago, or about 6 months ago, he and his brother published a New York Times best-selling, a book that was actually quite different. It was sort of a real departure from the ways that actually I think they've talked and written about innovation before. And the book was actually called Creative Confidence. And the point around it was actually much more around us as individuals and how we think about and kind of open up creative confidence in our day-to-day activity. And so today what we're really going to talk about is we're going to start talking about creative confidence, some of the things that it's represented and what it means, and we'll hear a lot from Tom. And then I have a few kind of other questions I want to throw at Tom just from other hats that he wears at IDEO as well. And then we're going to try to open it up for questions in at least a good 15 minutes so that we can actually have dialogue, because we know a lot of people in the audience and we know you have questions. So I guess I want to start with just a really basic one, which is in your mind, as you've been writing about it, what is creative confidence? What does it mean?
Sure. We stumbled on this idea a few years ago, and when I'm sitting next to somebody on the plane and talking about it, they'll say, oh yeah, creative confidence, I know about that, and they start in and we start this conversation, and then almost always they'll stop partways in and say, wait, what do you mean exactly? Right? And so we found it's quite useful to define a little bit, and so we think of creative confidence as two things in almost equal measure. The first is the natural human ability to come up with great ideas. And we really believe this is natural. We think everybody's got it. Some people have successfully buried it a little deeper than others. But it's there, and everybody, and we watched it. We interviewed 100 people that successfully unburied it. So it's half that natural human ability, but it's the other half, and probably equally important, is the courage to act on your idea. Because especially in the business community, but you've talked to people in lots of different parts of life, they're in a meeting in which something that is important to them is being discussed, and they have an idea, right? And they think their idea might help with the topic at hand, but they kind of look around at the landscape of the meeting, and they look around at the culture of the organization that they are a part of, and then they do a kind of a mental calculation, and they decide that on balance, for themselves, it's best not to raise their hands. If I raise my hand, people might think I'm weird. If I raise my hand, I might attract the attention of the devil's advocate. If I raise my hand, gee, that's a lot of work, I'm not going to raise my hand, right? And so they don't raise their hand, and that idea, we don't even know yet if it's a good idea. They're not sure, they think it might be. The idea runs down the drain. Meeting ends, they go back to business as usual. And so you got to have both, right? You got to have the ability to generate that idea and the courage to at least voice it and hopefully act on it, prototype it.
So I have a question, and for those of you who were at the opening yesterday, Alpha Woodward did a really amazing, I think, lovely kind of conversation or a big idea around creativity. And one of the things she said was the creative impulse is in our bodies like blood, or something like that. And so the implication being that we all carry it. It's all in us. And yet it goes away. And I think the notion is that even as children specifically, we really embody creativity, and yet as adults, often many of us won't identify as creative.
Right.
What is that? Like, how does it get broken down over time?
Well, so think back to kindergarten, right? If you can remember your own kindergarten days or your kids' kindergarten days, everybody's creative in kindergarten. There's that great guy, Gordon McKenzie, used to go around and speak at schools, and he'd ask each grade, any artists here? And he says, kindergarten, not only is everybody an artist, everybody's a two-handed artist. Me, I'm an artist, right? And he says in the first grade, they're still 100%, but one-handed. They're one-handed artists. And then it progresses, and he goes through and he gets to the end of the school day, and he's talked to all these groups, and he gets to the sixth graders, and so the sixth grade, a lot of this starts happening, researchers say, right in the fourth grade is a pretty pivotal moment for this self-description about being creative. So he asks the sixth graders, any artists here? And he gets 2 or 3 hands, people, and they're nervously looking around, like not wanting to be judged by their peers, right? Oh, people are going to think I'm weird if I raise my hand and say I'm an artist, right? And so Gordon McKenzie says to the sixth graders, he says, hey, wait. He says, what happened here? He tells them about the progression of his day, how it started with the kindergartners, who were all artists. He says, what happened here? He says, what happened to all the artists at your school? He said, did all the artists here transfer out? Are they all at art school, leaving just the non-artists behind here? And he said, no, I think something far worse. He says, I think someone or something has told you in the last 6 years that it's not okay to be an artist. And he said, never mind everything else I said today. He says, kids, I want you to go home. I want you to remember this. It is okay to be an artist, right? And so what happens, one of the things that happens is a really interesting breakfast this morning. We were talking about failure a lot. And people do fear failure, even though we know that's how you learn, right? Skiing, right? We were in one of the great ski resorts of America here. Anybody ever learn to ski, right? Anybody ever learn to ski without falling down, right? If you say, okay, I want to learn to ski, I want to be a great skier someday, but I never, ever, ever want to fall down, that's the same as saying, I never want to learn to ski, right? Failure is a part of that process, and we kind of forget that. But with those kids, and then especially with us adults, it's not always just the fear of failure, it's the fear of being judged. Right, along the way. Because you see kids when they knock something down, the first thing they do is look around to see if anybody saw it. Really no harm done if they knocked the chair over but nobody saw it, right? It's the fear of being judged. And so that's a part in that meeting when you don't raise your hand. It's not exactly fear of failure, it's fear of being judged. And so you got to kind of overcome that and say, I'm not going to be perfect, but I'm going to try stuff. And if you can develop that attitude, it unlocks a lot of that creativity you have inside of you.
So the book is actually really all about unlocking that. And Tom hates this, but if you like to read a little bit, but not a lot, chapter 7 has all the how-tos. So you can just kind of read that chapter, and it'll get you through everything you need to get. It would make a nice slim pamphlet. I think actually it's like that. But I'm going to just throw out a couple things that are kind of, I would say, triggers to the ways you think about creative. And I'd love to hear your responses and kind of why. Why is that core? And so I'll start with the first one, which kind of figures heavily in the book, which is empathy and understanding people. Why is that an important creative trait as you see it?
Sure. So there's problem solving that we all try to do every day. And a lot of people burden themselves with the thought that says, oh, I have to have all the answers, right? If I'm really smart, I got to have the answer to this tough problem. And in fact, you almost never have the answer, right? But a lot of people, they're forced to kind of pretend that. And so what we've discovered is if you first have kind of some humility about it that says, okay, I don't have the answer, but I know how to get the answer. And the way I'm going to get the answer is I'm going to understand the humans in this equation a little better. I'm going to go out in the world and I'm going to sit with people and I'm going to observe them and I'm going to talk to them. You not only get help solving your problem, you get help with what we would call need finding, because sometimes the problem doesn't even present itself to you. You have to go out in the world to articulate the problem, right? And sometimes, by the way, once you find the problem out there in the world, the solution's easy, right? But with all of our work, we start with empathy. And this is not about the opposite of technology. We are blending technology with humanity. And what we find is if you get that mix right, then you can create technologies that people love.
Can you give an example? I'd just be curious to...
Sure. Blending technology with humanity. So interviewed 100 people for the book. I love all of the interviewees. I mean, love them. And so I promise I won't tell you all 100, time and all. But so perhaps my favorite one, and some of you may have heard this story because we love it so much. You might have heard my brother tell it, for example. But so we meet this guy who's just a wonderful guy. His name is Doug Dietz, and he works at GE Healthcare. And if you know GE, this is a serious company, right? They've got metrics for everything. They're really, it's really intensely managed and very, very much about technology. And Doug creates these very high-tech machines, these medical scanners, like MRI machines and CT scanners. And he's proud of his work, and he's good at it. So at GE, when you're finished with a project, they have this thing called Voice of the Customer, in which you go out and you see your product in use and you ask some questions about it. And it all on the surface sounds exactly like what we're talking about. Like humans, you go talk to humans and you see what's up. Well, except there's this part about empathy. And so Doug really hadn't done it with much empathy. And so he finishes one of his projects, 2.5 years. Takes a long time to make one of those big machines. 2.5 years, new machine out in a local children's hospital, and so he gets a chance to see it, and he welcomes this chance, and so he goes and he talks to the technician who runs the machine. And Doug, telling his story, and you can see Doug tell it himself in certain TED Med talks, Doug says, I am so embarrassed now when I think about what questions I asked. Doug, by the way, very emotional about this whole process. Doug cries when he tells his story. I'm not going to cry, but he says, every question I used to ask that technician was about patting me on the back. Well, have you noticed this feature? Have you used this yet? Did you know it's up for a design award? It's all about self-validation. So he did this. He finished his conversation with the technician one day after this new product release, and he's now leaving the scanning suite. It's in this big room that's isolated. And he's leaving that suite, and just as he's leaving, he happens to cross, with just kind of our luck that this chance meeting happens, he happens to cross this family. It's a patient coming in to be scanned in Doug's machine. And it's a little girl, and the girl's crying. And the parents, he says, tension written all over their faces. And as they pass, the dad is kind of whispering to his daughter saying, honey, now we talked about this. You can be strong, right? And Doug's like, what's up with this? This is outside of his field of knowledge about this great machine he makes. So he goes back and talks to the technician. And he says, so wait, what's up here? Like problem patient? What's happening? And the technician says, oh, Doug, you didn't ask this question. She says, your machine scares the heck out of kids. In fact, she says, Doug, you didn't ask about this either. Your machine is so scary to kids that we have to anesthetize 80% of our pediatric patients so they can survive, so they can endure the experience of being in your machine. And Doug, who's this super sensitive guy, has a personal crisis. He goes home and tells his wife that he might have to change jobs. He might have to change careers because he's always been so proud of being part of the healing process. And now he's had this awakening that says, I make big machines that scare the heck out of kids, right? And so he goes to his boss. He's not one to hold his emotion back. And so he tells his boss this story, and the boss sends him to this executive ed program at Stanford University where my brother founded. But anyhow, he's only there for a week. It's a week, and there's nobody else from GE there, and it's not even other R&D people. It's people from finance and HR and different parts of different organizations. But while Doug is there, and the week is all about starting with empathy. It's about blending technology with humanity, right? And while he's there, he gets this idea, and he goes back to GE to tell them how he wants to kind of reinvent his machines. And I'd be interested in hearing GE's version of this story sometime, but what Doug says is, well, how much did they like my idea? Well, let me just put it this way. I got 0 budget and 0 schedule for my idea. And as you may know, that's how corporations express their love, is, budget and, schedule. So he's got 0 budget and 0 schedule, but he puts together an all-volunteer army. It's GE people working in their spare time. It's people from that children's hospital. It's people, very importantly, he had the insight to engage a local children's museum. I think it's called the Betty Bryn Children's Museum. And together, they reinvent Doug's machines. Now, I talked about blending technology and humanity. You cannot touch the technology. You touch the technology, that takes 2.5 years and requires all these regulatory approvals, and so they don't. And so what they do, and a skeptic would say, well, Doug, all you really did was cover the machine with graphics. And they did, in fact, cover the machine with graphics. And so Doug's machines, they call the Adventure series now. There's one that looks like a spaceship, and there's one that looks like a pirate ship, and he's working on one that will be a San Francisco cable car, whatever. But it's not just, and by the way, it's not just the machine, it's the floors, it's the walls, it's the ceiling, it's this immersive environment. But really important to the piece, with the help of the Children's Museum, they write a script. In the script, like for the pirate ship, for example, the script says, okay, Johnny, today we're gonna put you inside the pirate ship, but while you're in the pirate ship, you have to lie perfectly still. Because if you move, the pirate might catch you. So you have to lie perfectly still. Johnny, do you think you can lie perfectly still? And yeah, it turns out Johnny can lie perfectly still, because in that hospital, the rate of anesthesiology goes from over 80% to under 10%. And Doug, who still takes the 10% to heart, says, Tom, I can't get it to 0. He said, there's other medical complications. I can't get it to 0, but I can get it under 10%. And Doug now goes back all the time. He says, he goes back, he doesn't talk to that technician anymore. He says, she's got nothing for me. Right? He says, I talk to the patients, I talk to the parents. He says, I live in an environment, and people from the business community will know this pattern. You live in an environment where everybody's got a metric, but everybody's happy with their metrics. He says, GE's got their metric that says sales go up and market share goes up because they have like 16 different of these Adventure series scanners out there. He says, the hospital's happy because throughput goes up. These machines are not cheap, as you may know. And what happens is patient shows up, they discover the patient needs anesthesiology, they call for the anesthesiologist. Now, I don't know about you, but I've called for the anesthesiologist twice in a hospital, both times in the delivery room, and has anybody noticed they are not waiting outside the door, right? You're a good 45 minutes, and some of you, there was at least one woman in this room screaming in that room I was in, like, now, anesthesiologist, now, and they still wait 45 minutes. So, from the patient standpoint, other things are happening, but from the hospital standpoint, it slows throughput when that happens, right? And so that's a metric for them, and throughput goes way up. He says, Doug says they can have their metric. He says, here's my metric. I go back all the time. He says, I talk to the parents and the patients. He says, I'm back in the scanning suite one day, talking to a young mom whose daughter has just been scanned in my machine. Doug's got this idea, which I kind of like, which is aromatherapy. Doug's idea that day is he's going to spritz the smell of pina colada into the scanning suite. And I said, really, Doug, are you sure pina colada? Because I'm not sure a kid knows what pina colada is, And he says, oh, no, Tom, not the kids, the parents. He says, I've studied this really closely, and the parents are carrying all this stress, and they are inadvertently transferring their stress to their kids. And he says, my theory is that the smell of a pina colada will trigger a relaxation response in adults. And I'm thinking, yes, that could work, right? So Doug, he's back in the suite, and he's talking to the young mom about the pina colada smell. And as he's talking, the little girl comes up and kind of tugs on her mom's skirt. Mommy, mommy, mommy. And eventually she's talking to Doug, but eventually she looks down, and she says, yes, honey, what is it? And this little girl looks up at her mom and says, Mommy, can we come back tomorrow? So Doug says, there's my metric. He says, I went from 80% of kids so scared they needed anesthesiologists to, Mommy, can we come back tomorrow? Right? So that's technology. GE's great technology blended with Doug's humanity. And it's been tremendously successful. And some of you may be happy to know Doug's next thing to tackle is the mammography suite.
Yeah, I think pina coladas will be in order there.
Yes,
I think
there you go.
that's where it's really going to come in. I'm going to throw out a couple more that come up
Sure.
in the book that I'd like us to hit. And this one I thought would be interesting, especially because we're all in Aspen, and it feels like it's actually of the moment. But you talk about the topic of relaxed attention, and I basically read it and I was like, I want that.
Yes.
What is that? And I have a feeling that we all do. And I'm just curious, like, what is it, and how do we get it, and why do we want it?
We've adopted this idea of relaxed attention partly because its equivalent, called daydreaming, gets a bad rap. Did you ever notice, I see a lot of movies. I see 200 movies a year. And in a school, like a high school movie, there's always a kid that gets in trouble for daydreaming. He or she is looking out the window and stuff like that. And so we as a culture believe daydreaming is bad, right? And so got to rebrand it, right? And so if we're rebranding rebranding daydreaming. I want to call it relaxed attention. And relaxed attention is when you're not focused, you're not on task, you engaging the kind of analytical parts of your brain, but you're also not completely zoned out. You're not asleep. You're not playing Angry Birds. You're somewhere in between. This kind of relaxed attention, where you're kind of holding an idea, perhaps gently in your mind, looking for maybe some idea you haven't thought of yet. And so everybody has this in their lives. And so the idea would be to try to gain more advantage from it, to be mindful of when during the day do you have these moments of relaxed attention, and try to find a way to capture more of the fresh ideas that come through to you. And so for lots of people, including my brother David, who I wrote the book with, for him it's in the shower, right? Lots of people say, it's not me, but lots of people say they have their best ideas in the shower. And I think I know why. There is no email in the shower, right? In fact, there's nothing to read, right? Except the labels on the back of the shampoo bottle. And so your mind has a chance to disengage just for a second. For some of us, that's the only 5 minutes of the day when you're not, reading emails or things. And so your mind floats. And so if that's the time for you, you've got to figure a way, maybe right after you get out of the shower, to say, any thoughts occurred to me today? My brother, taking this a step further, he's got a glass wall in the shower. He's got a whiteboard marker in there, right? Idea comes up, he writes it on the glass wall. And so for me, it's a different time of day, and you might try this and see if it works for you. First 5 minutes of the morning. So what happens is, and there's some neuroscience behind this, and there's some really smart neuroscientists here. I won't try to second guess them, but as I understand it, there's this part of your brain, the frontal cortex, goes to sleep at night, right? Ever notice that your dreams are wild? You're always flying through the neighborhood, or showing up at work without your clothes on, or things like that, right? And so so clearly that part of your brain, the executive center that's kind of controlling and managing everything, goes to sleep and lets the creative side of your brain run free. Well, my observation is that prefrontal cortex a little bit slow to wake up in the morning, a little bit like a teenager, right? And so you can take advantage of those first 5 minutes. You tap the snooze alarm, you got about 5 minutes. And so my advice to you, just try this as an experiment, would be don't jump up out of bed. Do people actually do that? I'm not sure. But don't jump out of bed. Don't go back to sleep. But try to just take those 5 minutes and hold an idea in your brain, something you've been working on, something you've been wondering about, and just see if you don't get some new thoughts on it. And then, very, very important, just like David in the shower, gotta have a pad of paper or some digital capture tool right beside the bed, because your short-term memory, your brain is dusting and cleaning all the time. You get an idea, it's trying to get rid of that one so you can get to the next thought. And so you got about 30 seconds in some cases to write that idea down. But yours might not be either of those. If you've got a long commute, it might be driving or on the train. But try to work on your creative yield by capturing more of the value that your brain is producing for you in those moments of relaxed attention.
That's great. And then big hint, you're in a great place for relaxed attention right now. Not in this room, outside. There's a lot of tools to help us. I'm going to ask one more that comes up, and that's failure. And you talked a little bit about this, but I guess I'm curious, why do creative people have to be more comfortable, more able to think about failure than everybody else? I mean, why is that a kind of key aspect of being creative?
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. Failure sucks. We're not saying that failure is fun. It's just that if you embrace it as the way that you learn, you can kind of disarm it a little bit. And so one way to get around this failure thing is to treat everything as an experiment, right? And so if you say, oh, this is going to be an experiment. In other words, this might fail. And then if it fails, you say, yeah, see, I told you it might fail, right? As opposed to, oh my God, I failed again, right? And so if you kind of marry up the idea of some failures with experiments, it really helps you a lot. And this is not just about, so at IDEO, some people think of it as like prototyping. We build hundreds of prototypes to create something. But it's far from that. It is a philosophy about how you make change in the world. So I was just talking a minute ago about Jim Hackett, just a wonderful guy who's just retired as CEO of Steelcase. Jim went to his senior management team, this is quite a long time ago, went to a senior management team and said, hey guys, it was mostly guys at the time. He said, hey guys, he says, anybody notice that we're the largest maker of system furniture in the world, and yet we, the executive management team, sit in these nice paneled closed door offices? Anybody think that might not be exactly the right thing to do? So he wanted to announce big change. He wanted to take people out of their offices. Now, if you've ever worked in a company and gone through a change of space of any kind, this is intense. This is like highly politicized. So he said, I could have done big change. So big change would be old way, new way. He said, I could have announced like, we're blowing up your offices and you're going to live with this new system. He said, I could have done that, and one by one, every single manager that reports to me would come into my office and spend an hour telling me why they were special, and it could apply to others maybe, but couldn't apply to them. He said, I'd have gotten resistance. But he said, I didn't announce big change. I announced small experiment. And what he said to his team, and you can apply this to any initiative you're working on. He said, I propose the following experiment. He said, in this experiment, I'm going to leave your nice paneled offices intact, and I'd like to invite you to join me, because he's doing it too, join me in the open air leadership community, in which we will use the best of our tools, and you'll be out in the open, and you'll communicate with each other, and you'll communicate with our team at large. And he said, all I ask is that you give this an honest try, right? And then a really important part of this experimentation process, Jim says, and my promise to you, right? And Jim is this guy of deep integrity, and everybody took him at his word. He said, my promise to you is do this with me for 6 months, and at the end of 6 months, what is not working, we will address. We will try to figure out how to make it better. He never said, and you get to go back to your old office. He never said that, but he said, yeah, I promise you we will address it. And so Jim got 0 people complaining or dragging their feet. Because honestly, who could drag their feet? It's like, no, boss, 6 months? No, I'm not the kind of person that could do something for 6, even if your boss wasn't the CEO, that would be very hard to say, oh, no, I never try anything new, right? So they did it without complaint. They did it, and then 20 years passed. And so when we were working on the Creative Confidence book, I actually talked to some of the Steelcase leaders who were still there and said, it's way better. It's way better. We have much better communication with each other, with the company at large. It's better, right? He got them to better, not by announcing big change. He did it by announcing small experiment. So if you can do this with yourself, by the way. I do this with a new book. Books, I love books and I love to read, but you get a 300-page book, that's a commitment. That's hard. I'm not sure I have time for 300 pages. But if you say, I'm going to do this as an experiment, I'm going to read chapters 1 and 2 and then decide whether, I'm going to feel 0 existential guilt if I stop at chapter 2, because the book is an experiment. I'm going to read 2 chapters and then decide. You can do this with people around you. You can do this with yourself. Yes, some people might choose to call that failure. I would choose to call it an experiment.
And again, chapter 7, if you're going to read one. It is interesting because I think that one of the things that we see, we do a lot of work right now in public sector and in large-scale philanthropy, and every one of our clients says, well, we can't fail,
Yes.
and one of the things I think we have to remind people is basically saying, well, the reality is, it's not like when you're working with Mayo Clinic, they're saying, hey, we'll fail, it's like nobody's basically saying, we can fail, but the reality is it's like this experiment model really helps in terms of getting people over the hump.
And we did work with the Mayo Clinic, and it was not, we weren't risking anyone's lives. We were talking about, let's do experiments about the way we deliver service. We have a cool experiment going on right now in the San Francisco Unified School District. We last summer, a year ago, we took over a cafeteria in the San Francisco school system, and we came up with ideas. First, we started with empathy. We studied how school lunch programs work, and it's way dysfunctional in many ways. But one interesting aspect of it is, as you may know, it's a federally subsidized program, and in order to get your reimbursement from the federal government, you must have an auditor. You must have someone at the end of the line confirming, like watching each student, confirming that each student left that cafeteria line with at least 2 fruits or vegetables, right? Well, and the auditing stops there, though, right? We, of course, follow the kids back to their tables and notice that they don't always get to those fruits and vegetables, right? Because they eat dessert first, right? But anyhow, so we, having studied it pretty deeply, we then had to communicate with everyone in the universe about this idea, because in social innovation there's lots of constituents. So, it's the students, it's the teachers, it's the school board, it's the parents, right? And so we are currently conducting an experiment because we believe we can get the kids to eat those fruits and vegetables. But in order to do that, we have to ask for a variance from the federal regulations of the school lunch program. And here's the experiment currently going on, this is for the grade school, there's different programs for each level. They sit down and lunch gets served kind of dim sum style. They sit at the table where there is not yet any food, and a cart comes by and delivers their food course by course. Right? So you got these kids who've been super energetic, they've just come off the playground, they're hot and they're sweaty and they are hungry, right? Especially the kids that the food program is targeted at, which, they're from the food insecure households. We got hungry kids sitting at a table and a cart pulls up, and guess what the first course is? Nothing but fruits and vegetables. And we are positive the kids will eat the fruits and vegetables. But the federal government is not yet positive, and there's lots of people to make happy in the San Francisco Unified School District, and so it's still at the prototype stage.
That's great. That's awesome. So I'm going to ask one more question on this and then move on to another topic. But creative confidence, and I'm just how do you play that out against something like the notion of creative cockiness? Like,
right.
Where does it get too far? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so here's I've been out, the book came out last October, and I've been slowly around the world, going to 11 countries this year to talk about creative confidence. Iceland, who knew that they cared about creative confidence in Iceland? But anyhow, and then I bump into this, because we use the word confidence in the title, it goes to, like overconfidence, it goes to arrogance and whatever. And ironically, although I still like the title, it misleads some people, because we are not talking about thinking you're the smartest person in the room, right? It's actually kind of the opposite. Creative confidence is not about knowing the answer. Creative confidence is about trusting a process that says, ooh, this is a tough challenge, and I don't know the answer, but I know how to attack this challenge. And I'm going to start with empathy. I'm going to go out in the world and understand how humans interact with my challenge, right? I'm going to prototype my the possible solution to my challenge, and then I'm going to listen really well again to how people react to my prototype without being defensive about it, right? And then when I think I've got a solution, I'm going to build a story around my idea and then see how people react to my story. And so it's confidence in an approach, in a process, maybe in a mindset, but it's not confidence in saying I got all the answers. It's pretty much the opposite of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're trying an experiment here at Aspen right now, and I think it kind of relates to that, which is I think that people had tended to think that if you're creative, you're just it's like this wild, noisy thing. Like it's like
right.
you're basically everyone's like yelling stuff out. And one of the things we've realized, I think, over the years is that the most important creative act is actually listening. That actually listening really well. And I think the
right.
Doug Dietz story is a great example of that. It's one of the most critical things. And so
right.
we're actually doing a series of things on creative listening here, just to sort of say, can we rediscover the creative act of listening and actually how you can pull things from it. So I definitely check that out if you have time. But.
Yeah, this thing about defining the creative ones or the noisy ones and stuff like that. I mean, what's happened, we've discovered both in research for the book and then subsequent to its publication, is people have a pretty narrow definition of what creative is. Right, and part of making that definition so narrow, they've drawn a circle and they are on the outside of it. And we had a really sweet, as I said, I like all 100 of our interviewees, and one really sweet one was this young woman who works for us. Her name is Jill Levinson. And Jill walked around, as many people do, like, oh, I'm not creative, right? And in case she wasn't sure about whether she was inside that circle or not, Jill first worked for an ad agency out of school, and in ad agencies, they've got the creative department, right? And if you're not in the creative department, draw your own conclusion, right? It supported her belief system around that. And so she came to IDEO still holding on to that belief system. And I actually thought she was creative from the beginning. She shows up at work with these beautiful cakes. She, I guess, takes cake decorating courses, and she brings these cakes that are like works of art to the office, but she'll say, oh, no, I'm not creative. I didn't make up the recipe for that cake. So I'm going to keep making it a little smaller. No, I may create art, but it's not my art, so I'm still not creative. And then a really fun thing happened, which was Jill, just on the side, started playing around with Pinterest. Anybody pay attention to Pinterest? So yeah, lots of hands. And I didn't see any guys raise your hands, but guys, if you raise your hand, forget it. You are invisible to Pinterest. So we've had the Pinterest folks over, and when they talk about their customer, they say she and her, and like you might stumble onto their site, you may even like their site. That's okay, but don't expect them to ever speak to you about it, right? So anyhow, so she starts playing with Pinterest, and she's got 6 followers. It's her 6 girlfriends, which is fun, but her stuff is pretty good. She's got these really interesting pins, and so the 6, tell their 6 friends, and goes, and next thing Jill knows, she's got 1,000 followers, which is pretty darn respectable, right? And then it continues to build a little bit, but then one day she has this really, really good pin. If you've spent any time on Pinterest, you may have seen this one. It's about Pinata Cookies. Anybody ever see this? Well, first of all, you have to make 7 different colors of dough and put them in the fridge overnight. This is really, Jill made the Pinata Cookies for me. I'm so indebted to her because this takes a lot of work, right? 7 different colors of dough, and then you put them in the freezer overnight, and then you line them up, and then you roll them out, and then you put the cookie cutter, and then you cut, it's in the shape of a burro, of a donkey, right? But you have to make 3, and so you've made 3 cutouts in the shape of a donkey, and then on the middle one you take a juice glass and you cut a circle out, and then you put the 3 together, and then you put M&Ms in the circle that you cut out of the middle layer, and then the kid breaks it open, and M&Ms come out like it's a piñata, and you must really love that kid if you're making those piñata cookies, right? But they're so beautiful too, which is I think partly why it works so well on Pinterest. And so Jill suddenly has 100,000 followers. Right? And then Pinterest, they got big data, right? And they see this trend line, and Jill Levinson's line goes like this one day, and they said, what's up with this Jill Levinson woman? Let's go talk to her, and they do, and they put her on their homepage, and next thing Jill knows, she's got 1 million followers. So my book goes to press, it's a million followers, and it's currently 1.8. So I have a deal with Jill that the day it hits 2 million, she's going to tell me, right? But meanwhile, this is a big change on Jill. Gets back to listening. She's listening to her followers, and she says, you know what? She says, I am creative, right? I'm not creative in that old way. I don't make up the recipes for things. She says, but my followers tell me I have a creative eye, right? I'm a kind of a creative collector of ideas, and my followers really, really like it, right? So I'm going to do more of this. And so first thing that happens is Jill, we call it flipping. Jill goes from I'm not creative to I am creative. And when this happens, people glow. I mean, it is really fun for them. And so it might be enough. I mean, it's kind of enough for me that Jill has that great self-actualization, but it doesn't stop there. Jill now, with this like a new kind of I'm creative outlook, she takes on bigger tasks. She's got more like resilience when things don't go, well all the time. She's just making a bigger contribution at work. By the way, part of what attracted me to Jill's story is I ran into her mom somewhere, and she says, do you know my daughter? She says, she is so different. She's just like come alive. And she came alive partly through this process in which she now believes she's creative. And we are feeling the effect. I mean, Jill in herself is, but we're feeling it too, right? And so I think Jill's story is all of our stories. Right? What Jill did, if you think about it, is she just stretched that circle a little bit. She changed her definition of what's creative a little bit. And so she enabled her to step inside the circle instead of being outside the circle. Changed her impact on the world. So I'm
going to ask one last question, I think. How are we doing on time? Yeah, cool. So I'm going to ask one question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience so everyone kind of think about what they might be wondering about. But sort of different topic, but actually but connected, is that there's been a lot of discussion right now around disruption. It's come up a lot. There was a New Yorker article, I don't know if many of you have read it, on disruption, and a kind of a sort of significant online dialogue, and it's been coming up in the conversations here. And one of the things that actually has come up in the writing is that, in fact, disruption has there's a lot of negative verbiage around it, right? It's like it's fear-based, or it's it actually can sound quite aggressive in place. And one of the things as you're talking is it feels to me that there's at a foundation in creativity, it's optimism-based. And so I guess I'd really love to kind of hear a little bit about your thoughts on this discussion around disruption and how that relates to the notion of creativity as you've been thinking about it.
Yeah, interesting discussion. I don't know if you've been following this, sort of the New Yorker a week or two ago, and back and forth. And there's one thing that I think all parties agree on is that maybe the word has been overused. That everything that someone thinks is new, they call it a disruption as a kind of way to get people to buy into their idea or something like that. And so has it maybe been overused? Yeah, I think so. And still what I see both in the private sector and the public sector is I still see people being disrupted every day, right? And so I think it behooves us all to be aware of the possibility of us being disrupted and thinking about how we're gonna defend, right? There's disruptors and there's disruptees, and I think Clay Christensen would say the only way to fight the disruptors is be your own disruptor. Out innovate them. And sometimes this is about competition, and a lot of the stories that you hear are about a worthy competitor undercutting someone on price. But sometimes it's about the world changing. If you think back, there's a metaphor that I kind of like, not everyone does, but is the dinosaurs. You think about, you call somebody a dinosaur, that's not the sweetest thing you can say about them, right? But lest we diss the dinosaurs too much, the dinosaurs ruled the earth for approximately 100 million years, right? I don't think anybody could fault you for being slightly complacent if you were number one in your industry for 100 million years. I don't know if that little dinosaur brain can even do complacency, but they've been on top so long they don't know what it's like not to be on top, right? And so maybe they get a little complacent, but think about what happened to the dinosaurs. Well, think about what didn't happen. The story of the dinosaurs is not a story of competition. No bigger animal came along and ate them. In fact, no little animal came along and ate them piece by piece. No, what happened to the dinosaurs was nothing about competition. It was about the world changed out from under them. The world changed faster than they could adapt. And there is a cautionary tale for all of us. Because I don't know if you've noticed out there, the world changing pretty darn fast. The world in general, but then the world, the part of the world that you spend most of your time on, whether it's your industry or your philanthropic association, stuff is getting reinvented all the time. And so for us as individuals, for us as organizations or teams, we ought to be waking up in the morning thinking, am I changing as fast as the world outside is changing or not quite as fast? Because honestly, if we're not changing quite as fast as the world outside is changing, I'm not going to call anybody a dinosaur, but you're becoming more dinosaur-ish each day, right? And so that disruption is happening. I mean, there's newspapers. We were recently consulting with a newspaper client. So part of it is they have, competitors, online competitors to the print publication. But part of it, the classified ad portion of newspapers has been demonetized, right? There's not a competitor there. They got to reinvent themselves to deal with the fact that a good part of their revenue stream just went away and it's never coming back. There's a session, I think it's tomorrow morning, about libraries. If you work, if you're associated with a library, a public library in America today, you've got to be thinking about reinvention, right? It's not really a competitor per se, but got to be reinventing if you want to keep the great tradition of libraries we've had going all the way to back to Benjamin Franklin, right? And so disruption is happening. You could talk about individual cases. Did U.S. Steel get fully disrupted or not disrupted? I don't really care about U.S. Steel, but I do care about the companies I work with and the teams I work with, and they seem like they're all in the process of being disrupted if they don't keep up their pace of innovation.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. So we're going to open up for questions, and one thing I'll say is that if you raise your hand, if you'll wait for a moment, because we have microphones, because we'd like to make sure that the whole audience gets to hear the question. So raise your hands, and I'll call. There's one right here, the one with the glasses. By the way, up here, all you can see are glasses. So
the lights are pretty bright. Yeah.
Good morning. Shelley Porgas, Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for your insights on creativity. When you thanks for sharing the Doug Dietz story, and it really kind of surprised me when you said that GE was not responsive to him, and the reason is the following. GE is now running this ad where it's a little girl talking. They've been running it for a while now. Yes. You're probably familiar with it. That says, my mom builds windmills yes. under the ocean and powered by the sun, and yes. my mom builds trains that are friends with trees. And that also raises the question of, is there a difference in creativity between men and women in your work? I also thought when you told that story about the MRI machine, my first reaction was, he should have known. That would have been my first reaction as a woman, because you raise kids and they're scared of these big monster things. So I just wonder if there's a difference, if you found a difference in how men and women approach and view themselves as creators.
Sure. You look at our team, we're almost exactly 50-50 in the mix, and so I don't think there's one. I mean, as individuals, people are, better at communicating or maybe better at empathy. And so would I be willing to say that the empathy part comes a little more naturally to some of the women on the IDEO teams? Yeah, probably. But you need a diverse mix regardless, right? Should GE or should Doug have known? This is when we go out in the field and we do the studies, and when you come up with a kind of a breakthrough in the observation, this kind of epiphany, many times you used to say like, no, duh, how did I miss that all these years? A very long time ago, I talked about it in my very first book. Oral-B, now a division of Procter & Gamble, asked us to reinvent kids' toothbrushes, right? And so we go out, we do observations. Oh, by the way, they want us to start designing on day one. It's like, well, it's not rocket science. It's a toothbrush, for God's sake, right? And we're thinking, no, this is how we do it. We're going to start with empathy. And so, by the way, when we're doing this empathy stuff, we never, ever bring somebody into the office to try to observe them, right? It's absurd, but people do it. They have usability suites and stuff like that. But imagine if you're working on a kid's toothbrush, you bring the kid into the room and you say, okay, Rebecca, brush your teeth just like normal, except that today you're in a conference room with like 7 adults watching you. Like, oh yeah, be natural, absurd. So we follow them home, right? And we watch them brush their teeth, in the bathroom with the mirror and all that. And it's like the first day of observation, and we noticed something like so dead obvious we were embarrassed that we hadn't noticed it before, which is, we assumed, in fact, every kid's toothbrush in the history of the world up until that moment had made this assumption, which is mom and dad have big hands, right? And kids have little hands, so you want a kid's toothbrush, it should be smaller and skinnier than mom and dad's, right? Sure, perfectly logical when you're sitting at your desk. But when you follow a kid home, when you watch them actually brush their teeth, what you find is watching that 6-year-old boy brush his teeth, he doesn't hold it the way you do. You have dexterity. You have fine motor control. He doesn't have fine motor control. He fists it. He holds the toothbrush like this. Hey, kids don't need little skinny toothbrushes. Kids need big, fat, squishy-handled toothbrushes. And you may be thinking, yeah, of course, Tom, all kids' toothbrushes are big, fat, squishy-handled toothbrushes. Well, not on the day when we were doing this observation. So our client, Oral-B, came to market with the very first of those from this simple observation, and then had the best-selling kids' toothbrush in the world, right? But once we saw it, it's like, how did we not know? How did GE not know? I have no idea. But when they discovered, and thank God for Doug Dietz, he took it all away. So he had the idea, but he also had the courage to act, and he saw it all the way through. And now, of course, GE loves Doug, and Doug is influenced, and he may have influenced that commercial for all I know. Doug has become an ambassador for this design thinking approach and starting with empathy across this very large, very technically savvy company.
So we have about 10 people from IDEO here at the festival, and I would just call it that 90% of them are women. So you might want to have a conversation with them afterwards. You might get different insight, yeah. Actually. So it's
everybody but me and you.
That's right, exactly. So it's like, and I do Pinterest, so it's like, I'm up. A question right down here in the middle, no person in the white.
Hi, Fred. It's Ginny Galisa now. So I do a lot of work with families, and one of the common complaints that I often get from their fathers is that they'll say things like, oh, my son or my daughter, they're becoming writers or artists, and that's not a career. And I understand some of that thought process, because everyone is concerned about the earnability in the future. What words of wisdom do you have for those parents who are wanting to protect their children's future?
Yes. This is really a tough topic. I mean, by the way, the most eloquent talk on this topic, I think, is Liz Gilbert's TED Talk. If you haven't seen that, it's wonderful about this. As soon as you say you're going to pursue a creative career, people start worrying about you. Oh, that's going to be hard, right? And so there are other chapters in our book besides chapter 7. And there's one called Seek, which is about exactly this. It starts with a diagram I've seen my brother draw like 1,000 times, which is a seesaw, as a fulcrum, and on one side is a heart, and on the other side is a dollar, and about pursuing the heart at least a little bit. In fact, what we found pretty much with the history of the firm is if you pursue the heart well enough, the money will kind of take care of itself. Right, but as we interviewed people, and this came up time and time again in the 100 interviews for the book, people carry, even pretty well along in their lives, people carry this feeling of, oh, I got to do the right thing. I love this other stuff, but I got to do the right thing, and often it comes back to their parents. If I tell you that my wife is born in Japan, Japanese, and that my kids are, people perceive them as Asian kids, I think you'll at least allow me to say the next thing, which is this is, in my experience, there's more pressure on the Asian kids, or they feel more pressure, whether it's applied to them or not. You draw your own conclusion, but and so they have this thing they love, and then they have this thing that they try to do in work. And I think it's part of our responsibility as parents to let them explore that, to let them pursue it. And as we started collecting the stories in the book, all of the stories in the first round of the book were about people who got inspired and left their career, left their job, and went off and did something that was just following their passion. And our editor in New York said, Tom, not all the readers are going to be prepared to quit the job and the career. You're going to have to find some stories like Doug Dietz, like Jill Levinson. You're going to have to find some stories where they didn't, give it all up. But no, I think this is partly our responsibility. I think it's partly the school's responsibility to let people know that this is a possibility, and that if you talk to people in creative work, they just love what they're doing. They love it more than the average person loves their job. And so you think about it from the parent standpoint. By the way, the parents, including the, Asian tiger mom in my own household, they're just trying to do what they think is best for you. They want you to be happy, right? It's just they've got this definition of what, this concept of what's going to lead you to happiness. And if you interview people in creative jobs, you realize they're the happy ones, right? And so just letting people kind of pursue that and encouraging them, I think is part of our responsibility as parents.
So I think we have time for at least one more, so we'll take it right up front. I'm actually making you run. I'm giving you a lot of exercise. There's one right up here, actually, at this table. Here we go.
Okay, there we go.
I think it was Thomas Edison who said, I have not failed. I have found 10,000 ways that don't work. What do you say to overcompetitive parents who have scheduled every minute of their kids' days and think that daydreaming is a complete waste of time?
So I just spoke to the Creative Confidence book launched in South Korea early this year, and I spoke there, and it was a great event. The president, President Park, she was there and spoke, and one of our presidents, George W. Bush, was there, and 5 other world leaders, and anyhow, great event. But it was a panel discussion just like this, and the first question to me was, here in Korea, our kids study or do school-related activities from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. And so you're saying that they need to do this creative stuff? Are you saying our kids should work longer hours? And then I said, no, please don't interpret my remarks in that way. And so, yes, I think we all know we've got to find some white space, just like I was talking about relaxed attention. As grown-ups, as adults, you need some time that is unstructured. You need some time without email in front of you, without Angry Birds. Sorry if anybody in the room represents the Angry Birds company. But you need some unstructured time, because this is where you renew yourself. This is where you come up with ideas. And so, of course, our kids, even more so, need some time to do imagination, time to just play with sticks in the backyard. And so it gets back to the thing I said before about parents really wanting what's best for their kids. That parent that is overscheduling every minute, they think they're doing what's best for their kids. I think if you shine a bright light on grown-ups and ask them about this, the answer would be no. More scheduling would not make me a happier person, in my life. Never mind what achievements I might accumulate.
It's funny, I did a panel on this with Tom, on this topic with Tom a while back ago, and it was in New York, and one of the parents raised their hands and said, whatever happened to benign negligence? Like, it's like all the benefit of just like letting them free, so it's a really interesting question. I think we have time for at least one more question. I'm gonna go to the gentleman back here in the white, and then we'll see if we have time for any more after that.
My question is about an international base. You're quite American-centric. Do you see that America is more creative than other places, or do you see other places where creativity seems to flourish more? And what in the education system or in the system of growing up is different in the places as to in more nurturing creative places than less nurturing?
So first, because I've lived overseas and we have quite a global firm that I have used American examples, I confess, but we're really thinking this at a global level. We're currently trying to reinvent the school system for the country of Peru, by the way. We're in the process of building 200 schools dedicated to design thinking and this kind of 21st century learning, and so we're really interested in this, a global thing. But to your question about how creativity varies around the world, I'd encourage you to look at this. There's an Adobe survey called State of Create. I think it's a year old now, in which they go to 5 countries. And so it's not comprehensive, but they go to 5 countries. It's the US, Japan, Germany, the UK. It's either France or Germany. Sorry, can't remember. Anyhow, and they ask them, is your country creative? And how about these other countries on the list? And it's really comical to see the results. The UK, 90% of people in the UK thinks that the UK is the most creative country in the world, and that only 2% of people in the UK thinks the US is. And then you look at the US data and it flips it, it's the opposite. So every country, 4 of the countries in the survey say we're the most creative place in the world, but then there's other countries that are kind of okay. Every country feels that pattern except Japan. Japan thinks that the US is the most creative country in the world. And so we have, and there's where maybe the confidence part comes in. And so it does vary from place to place, but I don't think it's baked into the personality of the people. It is in some cases baked into the laws and the culture of the country. So for example, in certain countries in Europe, if you do a startup and you fail, and you have big losses, you carry those losses for the rest of your life, right? There's not a well-developed bankruptcy system, or there's not a well-developed venture capital system. And so in those cultures, when we talk about failure, what you want to do is make the cost of your failures lower and lower. You can do low-stakes experiments with the low cost of failure. You tell me I start a company, I'm going to carry that burden for the rest of my life, I might have second thoughts about entrepreneurship. And so that's the prevailing laws and beliefs. But we're doing this literally all over the world, and we think it applies pretty broadly.
Yeah. It's actually interesting. It's interesting that it's become a metric, that people are actually asking for it, and we're seeing that kind of increasingly. So it's a good sign. We're actually going to wrap this up, and I know there were people who were back there waving. I saw you. We're also going to let Tom off his leash, so you guys can totally free range ask him questions when he's done. But thank you so much for spending the morning with us, and thank you, Tom. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Fred.